Welcome to tranScrip Talks, the podcast for biotech and pharma companies. I am Rienk Pypstra, the Chief Medical Officer at tranScrip. I have 3 decades of drug development experience in infectious diseases, and I've worked in biotech companies as well as in big pharma, and I'm now in the consulting business. Today, I have in front of me David Findlay. He is the CEO of Rostra Therapeutics, and I'm looking forward to an interesting discussion about drug development in biotech. David, could you start by explaining a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, it's delighted to be here today, Rienk. My background is basically I'm a commercial guy. I've got, like you, 3+ decades in the pharmaceutical industry, but I was on the commercial side of the industry rather than the clinical development. I spent 20+ years at GSK, over 10 years in the global commercial strategy organization embedded with the R&D function. And then after leaving GSK, I then moved into the other end of the spectrum, working in a small biotech, Rostra Therapeutics.
So let's start with the first question that we really have, and it is about early strategic considerations in asset development. So we at tranScrip, we often support clients at early stages of development, and we try to help them shape a development path that balances the regulatory requirements on the one hand, the clinical feasibility on the other hand, and of course, the commercial opportunity at the end of the development cycle. Now, when you're at the very earliest stage of biotech innovation, what do you think are some of the key critical decisions that really set the tone for long-term success?
Yeah, I think there's probably 3 key decision areas that are very important right at the beginning of the journey. And I'd say the first thing is what does success look like? Where do you want your company to progress? Because without knowing where you want to get to, it's very difficult to plan a route to get there. So I think initially, setting a vision is really important. What do you want to achieve in the long term? That's a process that really needs to be done as a team, if possible, so that once you've got the vision, everybody's bought into that process. And from there, you can back into the mission and the values. So I think those are really key long-term strategic points. And they may sound a bit like big pharma processes, but they're also equally important for a small company so that you know the direction of travel. I think the second area, and this is especially true if your technology has a number of different uses, is to decide on your strategic focus. Small companies can only do so much, very, very limited resources. So you really need to do a whole load of market analysis, assess unmet needs, and decide which direction you want to go in as far as a disease area is concerned. And I think that's really important that you don't diversify too broadly. You have a very clear laser-like strategy. I think the third key element, once you've got those 2 in place, is to decide on your target product profile. What do you want your medicine to look like when it gets to market? This is really the blueprint for success for your product, or think of it as an architectural plan. I mean, you wouldn't start to build a skyscraper without a plan, and the same's true of drug development. You shouldn't really start a drug development process without a plan of knowing what your product needs to look like when it's completed. So for me, those would be the 3 key decision areas right at the beginning of the process: your vision, your strategic focus, and your target product profile. Just one other key element, which is also can be very useful for very early stage products, is a target candidate profile, which will take you up to candidate selection, partly because you really don't want to develop molecules that may fail expensively later on in development. So if you have a target candidate profile, that can be very useful as well.
So those are all very big questions and very important decisions to take. And I guess you want to take them early on, but how do you balance that with keeping your options open and maintaining that flexibility in development that you need?
Yeah, I mean, you do have to keep your options open because, of course, as we know, drug development is a very high-risk activity. And should your chosen direction of travel not work out due to many reasons, lack of druggability, lack of formulation availability in your specific area, then it's useful to have a backup strategy in place as well. But I think the key is not to try and do too many things at once. Sure, have a backup strategy, but don't try and do strategy A, strategy B, strategy C. Focus really tightly on what you want to achieve.
Now, you are the CEO of a spin-out from a university. That is really exciting stuff to do. But of course, it comes with complex challenges. And so from your personal experience, what are the biggest hurdles that you encounter when you're creating a new biotech, starting really from scratch?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there's different challenges for different founders. So from a commercial perspective, I've come from a big pharma background, so I've had to adjust to working in a very small startup organization, and all that entails. From an academic founder's perspective, I think the challenges are different in that academics are moving from an academic field, from a university department into essentially a commercial organization. And I think it's necessary to adjust from a pure discovery academic approach to drug development, which is a very focused approach on delivering the right data to meet regulators' requirements and those of clinicians and patients in the future. So it's a much more perhaps constrained environment than purely academic. We're very fortunate in Rostra to have very capable academics who are able to do this, but there are often gaps in capabilities there. So I think it's very important to have that adjustment. The other thing about, I think, which is complex sometimes from an academic perspective, is making sure that the investors don't expect what is unrealistic, and they have to be able to. Our academics are very skilled at communicating to investors about what the capabilities of the molecules are, and to ensure that the inflection points down the line are achievable and realistic. And I think the other thing that we all have to ensure that we adjust to is communicating and decision making between different functions, between the academics, between the operational group, between the commercial groups, because often their approaches and objectives or mindsets might be slightly different. So there's some fundamental readjustments to make when moving into a small organization.
Yeah, no, I recognize that, and certainly the time frame that the different players are considering can be quite different. If I want to caricaturize it a little bit, then investors want to have everything tomorrow, and the academics tend to say, oh, we'll get there in the end. And then your operational team says, oh, but we have agreed that we have this by this time. How do you reconcile those different expectations over time? Do you have tips for other biotech companies who may be facing similar problems?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very important to map out the development pathway. You know, if from a preclinical stage up to candidate selection, continue your preclinical beyond that through IND, and then into your clinical phase with phase 1. And there is obviously there's a lot of literature out there and experience out there from preclinical experts, clinical experts who can frame up the kind of timelines that these programs should take. And I think the investors, as you say, will be very keen to accelerate things as quickly as possible. But as that should align with the company philosophy as well, because the longer your product takes to get to market, the less benefit it can bring to patients, and the lower your opportunity will be. So moving things quickly through the development process is very important. And we operate very much as a project team. So we all hopefully buy into the same processes and decisions as we move through, and we agree when deliverables are. Obviously, there's challenges in meeting some of those timelines, but I think to have that team approach with shared objectives is very important across commercial operations and the science.
Now, you also mentioned that it is important to have a common plan that all the parties agreed to. And you mentioned that the TPP, the target product profile, was one of those key elements of the overall plan. Can you tell me a little bit more about the importance of that target product profile and how you find alignment between the different parties on the TPP?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that the TPP, as I mentioned, is like the blueprint of the product that you want to finally deliver. And some may think, oh, well, you don't actually need that until later on in the development process. But I think it's a very good target to have early on, because there are elements of the target product profile which are very, very important in the preclinical stages. For example, what activity does it have? What formulations is it likely to be applicable to? Solubility, all those kind of critical parameters are very important early on. So I think it's important to get that target product profile together, and again, do that as a team activity. We were fortunate, and we had people within the organization who'd done that on occasions before. But if you haven't, there's obviously external providers of expertise in developing target product profiles, and I think those can be developed, as I say, as a team activity. There's a number of iterations. It's not easy. You've got to go through each line of the target product profile and agree those. But then it does become a really useful tool to have. And also the other a key thing that I like to highlight about target product profiles is don't compromise on them too much. They shouldn't be changing on a weekly or monthly basis. If something happens in the environment, like there's a change in the regulatory environment or new competitors come to market, you may have to revisit your target product profile. But you shouldn't necessarily be doing it if your molecule is falling below the targets on certain parameters, because what you may end up then with is a molecule that's not competitive against products either on the market or coming through the pipeline. And you've always got to have that differentiation to bring patient benefit and success.
Now, what about regulatory foresight? In the early days, you can say, well, we're still doing research, we're still in the candidate selection stage. The regulatory aspects, they will come later when we go to the clinic and we need to seek the regulator's approval. Or is that already something that you take into consideration when you're going for your candidate selection?
Yeah, I'm very much in favor of early input on the regulatory side of drug development, because basically what you're doing as a developer is developing data that's going to meet regulatory requirements. So if you don't know what those requirements are, you're shooting in the dark, basically. So even at the candidate selection stage, I think it's important to consult either directly with the regulators or via consultants, whichever route is most applicable. And regulators are very keen to talk early. I think it's often industry which is lagging a little bit here, and the regulators are saying, "Come and talk to us," and the industry is not necessarily doing so. I mean, there's various initiatives such as the Innovative Licensing and Access Pathway, ILAP, from the MHRA, linking up with the NHS and the health technology assessors. And these encourage contact and provide an avenue whereby you can really identify what the regulators' requirements are as you move through that clinical pathway. And to me, it's never too early to start that process. And I think companies will get a very positive reception from regulators.
No, absolutely. I would like to echo that, particularly when you're talking about completely novel classes or novel therapeutic approaches. Then you need to be able to give the regulators also the time to come to understanding of the challenges for this particular product. And so then it becomes a two-way learning exercise.
Yeah, and something I would add to that is don't be put off by the thought of high charges from regulators. The regulators are very amenable to very low costs approach, even free approach by companies that they know don't have resources to be able to put into consultation. But down the line, they know the benefit of those early meetings.
Yeah, you're right. That's an important tip for small and middle-sized enterprises. Yeah. Now, other external input and expertise that is not necessarily available in your small company. You can't have an expert in everything in your company. What type of areas are critical that you need to or want to consult early on in the development cycle?
Yeah, good question. I mean, I think it depends on what capabilities you have in your company, partly. But really, if you're going to have early input into a number of different areas, because it really is unlikely that your founders are going to cover every capability of the complex drug development process. So, regulatory, as I mentioned, is key. Preclinical planning as well, I think, is a very important area, because academics are brilliant at what they do in the discovery arena, but not many of them do have that expertise up to and past candidate selection as well. So often that's a gap that needs filling. And there's ways of obtaining input early. There's obviously, you can go to conferences. You can build your own you can build your networks. Founders usually come to organizations with existing networks. Those can be built up through conference attendances, which are really useful arenas for understanding the market and the clinical needs. And going directly to consultants as well, and establishing relationships with them early in the processes can be very important.
Let's now jump to the next big topic, and it's really about planning commercialization. When do we really start with that? And in your view, when is the right time for companies to start to think about commercialization?
Mm-hmm. Well, you recall at the beginning I mentioned strategy, and you really can't set your strategy without some commercial evaluation. So I think doing market analysis early on is very important to understand where the clinical unmet need is and how will your asset match that unmet need. That's a really key important thing. And then you've got to think about what the investors are going to be wanting to hear from you. And they're really going to want to see that you've really thought through the commercial strategy for your product. So they're going to want to hear in your pitch deck what the problem is that you're addressing, how your technology addresses that problem, what's your strategy for delivering that molecule into a medicine for patients, what the team is, who's going to do that key work, and what the return on investment is. So all those components that need to go into a pitch deck before you even start talking to investors are going to be key right at the beginning of your process in setting up a new company.
Yeah, it's a bit of a chicken and an egg situation. You need the information to get your funding, and you need the funding to pay for getting the information. How do you solve that conundrum?
Yeah, I mean, I think what I would really focus on is at the beginning of a company, when you first set it up, is ring fencing some time, say 100 days, for example, to really do all this groundwork. Because what you're going to need is you're going to need a business plan, you're going to need a pitch deck, and you're going to need all those different areas we've talked about: regulatory, CMC, preclinical planning, market opportunity, all have to be included in that business plan and pitch deck. So you really can't do that and be trying to go out to investors at the same time, because often you only get one shot at an investor discussion. So unless you've constructed the complete story, then you're not going in and showing them your best. So I think some key time at the beginning, really focused on getting everything in place before going to investors, is absolutely key.
Yeah, I agree. It's very important to have that story straight. When we're talking about the early strategy, there are several elements that are important that need to be aligned. Yeah, the elements are starting with that TPP that you mentioned, your commercial expectations, but also you mentioned the regulatory pathway, and how deep do you go in trying to understand that that route to the market, that regulatory pathway and the steps thereafter.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is important to understand what the key data points are in the process to market. What will the regulators want to see before going into phase 1, and obviously down the clinical pathway into phase 2 and phase 3 as well. And those need to be then aligned with what the investors are wanting to see. What are the milestones? What are the key value and inflection points? When are they going to come? So timelines, inflection points, and associated costs. So that is going to be built around those key milestones of regulatory requirements, in effect. So I think it's really important to understand what they are, and what data is going to be needed at each of those to build that picture of your path to market.
So in an organization like yours, who typically takes the ownership of the commercial aspects? Because you're a group of scientists, you don't have a commercial person, and you certainly wouldn't need a full-time commercial person. So how do you organize that?
Well, you're right. Often startup or spin-out companies are a group of scientists who come out of universities with fantastic scientific knowledge about the product or the asset that they've been discovering and working on, but they don't necessarily have that commercial expertise to really go to the long term. What is it they're trying to achieve? And we're quite fortunate in Rostra in that we've got a nice balance between science and commercial and operations. But I think it is very challenging if you're coming out of university without any commercial understanding to really work out, where do you want to get to? Where is the market opportunity? How do you frame up that market opportunity? What kind of data do you need? How do you select strategic options? And out of those options, how do you choose which one you're going to go for? And also patient need. So patient and clinical need is absolutely critical. And again, it goes back to not only ensuring that you understand that process, but filling the gaps. So whether you go for external consultants or use your network, and another way, of course, is an advisory board as well, but which can be very useful because not only do they bring an external picture, but they can challenge some of your internal assumptions as well. So I think using that external input is absolutely critical, because there's always gaps in capabilities. You're a small company, you're never going to have all the capabilities there. So it's identify where you are missing skills and capabilities and filling those gaps, whether that's commercial or regulatory or preclinical or whatever it is.
You consider the whole mix of capabilities. Are there any of these that you say, these I must have in my organization, and these I really don't need them, or I even don't want them as part of my full-time organizational setup? And what would be the criteria for you to say, this I must have and this I do not need to have?
So I think there's a sort of caveat to that, in that you might say, this I must have this capability, but you can't actually afford it. So there are your founder capabilities, which are obviously key, but you're going to need a range of capabilities on top of that, and that would include commercial strategy capabilities, regulatory capabilities, preclinical and clinical development capabilities, market analysis. So I think all those are going to be important, and they're going to need elements of those right at the beginning to develop your business plan and your pitch deck. You're going to have to develop that understanding very early on. So I think there is a broad need for that input very early on.
Yeah. But you can't afford them full time.
Well, it would be nice if you could, but we operate certainly on a sort of virtual company basis. And there's lots of sort of fractional expertise available to small organizations. The challenge is, yes, getting the finance sometimes to support those. But there's many creative ways of working with experts that perhaps delay the financial burden to a little bit further down the line when you've got more investment.
And so the expertise that you do have in-house is then mainly the scientific basis, the foundation?
Yeah, I would say that's definitely the case with most spin-out companies, is that the spin-out comes from the university, and usually your scientific expertise comes as a founder who's worked on the technology in the university and then becomes a founder of the company involved. So usually your scientific expertise is very strong. And it's often the other areas, the commercial, the regulatory, the clinical, preclinical and clinical development, where you really need to fill the gaps.
We were thinking about the difference between hiring in certain capabilities and partnerships and strategic alliances. And these have existed, and I've seen them in several forms. What do you think about that? Where do you see the most value, and are there any areas where you really value long-term partnerships with certain groups over ad hoc renting of an opinion?
Yeah, I think it's a very good question. I think, what you do need internally to make all this work is a very sort of operational can-do attitude by all the founders, because they're going to have to put the science and everything else to work and make it happen, make that drug development process happen. You need the external experts for the reasons we've talked around, but I think it's really important to develop a long-term relationship with external experts if you can, so that they are really bought in and share your journey through the drug development program. In effect, you want them to take some personal ownership of your development process, because you're going to be working with them. You're going to need that input, and you don't want to be changing your route of expert input too frequently. That's costly, and you've got to build up personal relationships again. I think there are certain areas where you can pick expertise, and once you've passed that, you would perhaps need them again. For example, a preclinical plan. But there are other areas like, say, regulatory, clinical development, which is a lot longer process, where that continuity, I think, is very, very important. And if you've got an organization that can provide a number of different skills, then and you can build a relationship with that organization, I think that can be a very positive thing.
So thank you very much for this very insightful discussion, David. If you had to summarize the overall development process and the big vision about how things should work, how do you see that?
Well, I don't pretend to have all the answers of how things should work, but certainly from the experience I've had in a starting up a biotech, I think we've been very fortunate to have a balanced scientific and commercial operation. And the way I look at it is that from my experience of being market-focused, patient-focused, I've been able to support the science team with the vision, developing the TPP, understanding the market opportunities and the strategic direction. So in effect, I feel like the commercial group are at the patient end of the process, pulling the technology through the pipeline, and the scientists at the other end, they're developing the data and pushing it through the pipeline. So together it creates quite a nice balance of science and commercial, two very important activities.
Thank you. With that very beautiful picture of pushing and pulling in the same direction, it's a very nice analogy for the development process. Thank you, David.
Thank you, Rienk.